My child needs water.
Here, take this bread. We'll get you some water.
Please, just water.
Here you go.
Thank you.
Smoke drifted across the ruins like a slow-moving veil, soft enough to seem harmless until you breathed it in and tasted the bitterness of everything Germany had lost. It was early 1945 in Saxony, a season that should have brought thawing snow and the first hints of spring, yet the landscape felt stripped of all promises. Buildings sagged into themselves, wells stood cracked, and what had once been a village road was now only a zigzag of churned earth carved by retreating troops. Through that maze of dust and noise came a young German mother, her steps uneven, her breath shallow, and her child limp against her chest. She did not know how many kilometers she had walked. She only knew the boy's lips were dry enough to crack when the cold wind touched them. And though the war still thundered in the distance, she whispered the same plea with every step, as if saying it aloud might somehow bend the world back toward mercy. My child needs water. She had tried to find it hours earlier, but every pump she reached was either shattered, contaminated, or guarded by desperate men who refused her without even looking. Once, a Volkssturm fighter had shoved her aside, muttering that soldiers, not civilians, needed water to hold the front. Another time, a retreating Wehrmacht corporal simply shrugged and told her she should have stayed in her home. Never mind that the home in question no longer existed. So she kept walking west, following rumors that American forces had reached the edge of the district. People said many things about the Americans, most of them terrifying, that they shot prisoners on sight, that they took children, that they treated civilians as enemies. But in the hierarchy of fear, dehydration had now climbed higher than myths. If there was even a small chance that someone across those lines had a canteen to spare, then that was where she needed to be. As she neared the outskirts of an abandoned mill, the sound of engines pricked her attention. Not the chaotic clatter of German trucks, but the steady rhythmic hum of American half-tracks. Machines built for endurance, not escape. She stopped behind what remained of stone wall, clutching her son as if hiding him might preserve him. Dust swirled around her feet. Her heartbeat thudded in her ears. She had witnessed enough executions, heard enough screams, and seen enough uniforms to fear any silhouette carrying a weapon. And yet the child's head tipped backward like a wilting flower, and she knew hesitation was a luxury long lost. So she stepped out from behind the wall and toward the column of soldiers gathering near a makeshift checkpoint. At first, no one noticed her. American troops were hauling crates from their vehicles, shouting instructions over the engine noise. A medic team unfurled canvas bags. The air smelled of diesel, boiled coffee, and something unfamiliar, discipline perhaps, or simply order. She approached slowly, unsure whether to speak or wait. When a tall sergeant finally spotted her, he stiffened, hand drifting instinctively toward his belt. Not threateningly, just cautious, procedural. Their eyes met. And for a moment she forgot the myths and saw only a man startled by the sudden presence of a woman and child in a place designed for battle, not visitors. Her voice, when it emerged, was barely more than a rasp. Wasser bit, mein kein Brockwasser. The sergeant looked confused, then concerned. He called to someone behind him, and soon another soldier arrived. Young, probably 19, with the earnest face of someone not yet hardened by the worst things were demanded. He did not understand German, but he understood desperation. He glanced at the child's cracked lips, the mother's trembling arms, and the soot coating both of them like a second skin. Without waiting for orders, he unclipped the dented canteen from his belt and offered it forward. She froze. It was not refusal. She simply did not know what gesture she was witnessing. For years she had been taught to expect cruelty from this army, yet here was a soldier handing her the very thing she begged for. Her fingers shook as she accepted the canteen. The metal felt warm, as if touched by many hands, each preserving a different story. She tilted it gently, moistening her son's lips first. His throat quivered weakly as he swallowed, and for the first time in days, color returned faintly to his cheeks. Nearby soldiers paused their work to watch. Some leaned against crates. Others lowered their rifles slightly, not in carelessness, but in a quiet acknowledgement that something rare was unfolding. Even in war, moments of humanity had a way of stopping time. The mother sensed their eyes, but focused only on her boy, murmuring soft reminders that he was safe, that he should drink slowly, that she was still here. A medic approached cautiously, kneeling to check the child's pulse. He spoke in English, his tone calm, coaxing, professional. She did not understand the words, but kindness rarely required translation. He gestured toward the field kitchen setup on the far side of the checkpoint. Steam rose from its metal pots, curling into the cold air. The smell of vegetable stew drifted between them. Simple, but warm, nourishing, alive. The mother hesitated again, unsure whether accepting more help would bring consequences. The sergeant, noticing her uncertainty, motioned toward the kitchen with a small smile, the kind people use when urging frightened animals closer. She stepped forward slowly, clutching her son, unsure if the ground beneath her was turning into something new or simply another illusion. As she crossed toward the kitchen, civilians emerged cautiously from the ruins behind her. Elderly men with hollow cheeks, women carrying infants, even boys no older than 10 clutching tin cups. They had watched her approach the Americans and survive. Now, they waited to see what happened next. Rumors traveled faster than artillery, and one act of mercy could redraw the emotional boundaries of an entire village. The child's breathing steadied. His eyelids fluttered. The mother tightened her embrace, overwhelmed not only by relief, but by the strangeness of receiving help from those she had feared. She glanced back at the soldiers, half expecting the moment to collapse, for someone to snatch away the canteen or shout an order that ruined everything. But the Americans continued their work, reorganizing crates, setting water containers in rows, preparing for something far larger than one thirsty child. And then, as she stepped into the shade of the kitchen's canvas awning, her legs buckled. Exhaustion, long ignored, rushed upward like a sudden wave. The child nearly slipped from her arms. Before she hit the ground, 2 soldiers caught her, steadying her gently. For a heartbeat, she thought she would faint, but instead she looked up at the medic hovering above her, his expression focused, urgent, determined. He spoke again, softly but firmly, words she couldn't understand but instinctively trusted. And as the soldiers lowered her into a seated position, she realized she was no longer begging for life at the edge of a battlefield. She was in the middle of a decision that would shape the fate of everyone watching, because the line of civilians behind her was growing, and the Americans were preparing to act. The medic's hands moved with practiced calm, guiding the mother into a steadier position as the field kitchen steam drifted around them like a fragile veil. Her breathing was shallow but controlled. Her son slept lightly, his small body curled against her chest, as if sensing that, for the first time in days, danger was not the closest presence. Yet even as relief settled over her like a thin blanket, the question trembling beneath the moment still lingered. Why were enemy soldiers offering help at all? Why were they sharing water and food instead of turning civilians away, as the stories had warned? Few Germans knew that by the spring of 1945, American soldiers were following a quiet but profound directive, one that reshaped the final months of the war and the world that followed. The answer began long before this mother stumbled into their checkpoint. As the American advance pushed deeper into Germany, intelligence reports painted a grim picture. Mass displacement, failing sanitation, contaminated wells, and a civilian population teetering on the edge of famine. Eisenhower understood something that German leadership had neglected. Chaos did not disappear when armies retreated. It spread, like smoke finding every crack. If civilians starved, diseases would follow. If diseases spread, armies would suffer. If suffering became widespread enough, occupation itself would become an unmanageable disaster. And so, though the fighting was still active, orders had begun quietly circulating among American units. Stabilize where you can, prevent collapse, keep civilians alive long enough for a new order to take hold. Most soldiers did not see these directives as acts of charity. They saw them as strategy. But strategy becomes human when the battlefield shifts into a village full of children holding bowls instead of grenades. The sergeant who first noticed the mother did not know about the higher-level reports predicting civilian epidemics. He only knew that no commander wanted dying civilians at their doorstep. The young soldier who handed over his canteen had read nothing about occupation logistics. He simply saw a thirsty child. Yet their actions aligned seamlessly with the broader policy Americans would later call practical compassion, a deliberate effort to bring stability faster by softening the hunger that threatened to derail everything. As the mother rested against the canvas post, she observed the Americans with quiet curiosity. Their movements were efficient but not rushed. Even in foreign uniforms, she saw patterns she recognized. Men lifting crates with coordinated ease, cooks tasting stew to ensure it hadn't scorched, medics washing their hands with the diligence of people taught that disease was as deadly as any bullet. It was the opposite of the panic she had witnessed among retreating German units. There, desperation ruled, soldiers grabbing food from civilians, hoarding water, demanding passage. Here, structure ruled. Even their voices carried something unfamiliar, command without fear. Behind the mother, more civilians began approaching the checkpoint. Some limped, others carried children whose eyes were glazed with dehydration, and a few walked with measured steps, as if unsure whether hope was a safer choice than despair. The sergeant saw them gathering, and for a moment he hesitated. His rations were limited. His orders were general, not tailored for moments like this. But he knew the calculus all American units were quietly learning. A few liters of water might prevent a riot. A bowl of stew might prevent a disease outbreak. And compassion, measured in ounces rather than ideology, could be the difference between a manageable occupation and a spiraling disaster. He signaled toward the kitchen. The cooks nodded and began preparing additional servings, scraping the bottom of one pot while another simmered behind it. Thick vegetable broth, traces of barley, and cubes of potatoes floated in the steam. It was simple food, nothing luxurious, but to civilians who had survived on ersatz coffee and crumbly black bread, it felt extravagant. The medic checked the mother's pulse again, then handed her a tin cup of warm milk, instructing her with gestures to sip slowly. She obeyed, feeling warmth spread down her throat and settle into the hollow ache inside her. Nearby, the young soldier who had given the canteen glanced toward the incoming crowd and muttered something half-joking to the sergeant, likely about running out of supplies before nightfall. The sergeant snorted quietly, but there was no annoyance in it. Humor, even thin humor, had a way of softening the edges of impossible days. Yet as they worked, both men glanced again at the mother, perhaps realizing that her arrival symbolized something larger than one family struggle. The policy guiding their actions was not written with poetic language or grand gestures. It spoke of civic order, public hygiene, and civilian stabilization. But on the ground, those bureaucratic phrases translated into moments like this. A mother rediscovering trust in a place she expected to meet hostility, a child surviving because enemy soldiers valued life over revenge, and a line of civilians gathering because they sensed the war's final chapter might be shifting into something different, something survivable. As villagers approached, the Americans began establishing a more formal distribution line. Water containers were placed in rows, bowls were filled with measured care, and soldiers began counting out ration biscuits. The mother watched all this through half-lidded eyes, exhaustion making her movements slow but not dulling her awareness. She noticed how carefully the soldiers portioned their supplies, how they tried not to show worry when they glanced at the dwindling pile of bread, how they avoided gestures that might resemble force or ownership. It was not generosity without limits. It was generosity calculated for endurance. For the Americans, this was not just a moral act, but a recognition of a new reality. Germany would soon collapse. When it did, chaos would threaten everyone in its path. But if civilians saw Americans as providers instead of conquerors, the transition might come with fewer outbreaks, fewer riots, fewer desperate stampedes through cities already buckling under war. Helping people live today meant fewer emergencies tomorrow. And so, unofficially but unmistakably, the soldiers embraced a mission they had not trained for, feeding those who had once been told to fear them. The mother exhaled slowly, clutching her recovering child, relief mixed with disbelief. She wondered what stories she would tell if they survived, what truths would replace the rumors she had been taught. Around her, civilians stepped forward one by one, uncertain but hopeful, drawn less by promises than by the evidence simmering in the soldiers' pots. But just as the lines steadied and a newfound order began to settle, a shadow fell across the kitchen entrance. A corporal hurried toward the sergeant, whispering urgently. The sergeant's expression shifted. Something had changed. Not a threat, but a complication. The mother, sensing tension, tightened her grip on her son. The Americans looked toward the road. More people were coming. Many more. Dust lifted from the road in slow, restless waves as more civilians emerged from the ruins. Women carrying sagging bundles. Elderly men leaning on makeshift canes. Wide-eyed children stumbling in step with parents who no longer had the strength to shield them. The American sergeant watched the growing line and exhaled through his teeth, not in frustration, but in recognition. This wasn't a moment. It was becoming an event. A village starved of water had discovered its first reliable source in weeks. Word would spread. It already had. The young soldier who had given up his canteen earlier moved toward the entrance to keep the line orderly, though he did it with open palms and gentle nods rather than commands. The Germans approached cautiously, unsure of whether this kindness extended beyond the lucky few who arrived first. A grandmother stepped forward, her hands trembling as she offered a tin cup so dented it looked older than the war itself. The soldier filled it with measured care, then gestured for her to drink before the cold stole the warmth from the liquid. Her lips quivered around the rim, not from the heat, but from the shock of being treated as if she still mattered in a world that had collapsed around her. The mother watched all of this from her seat near the canvas post, her strength seeping back slowly. Her son now rested with his head against her collarbone, breathing deeper, as if the steady rhythm of American boots and the smell of boiling stew formed a cocoon of safety he had forgotten existed. She had lived among soldiers all her life, marching columns, drilling cadets, officers shouting across courtyards. But she had never seen soldiers like these. They did not bark orders, did not inspect, did not accuse. Instead, they focused entirely on the immediate, practical business of keeping strangers alive. Civilians in the line began noticing the same contrast. Many had endured months of forced requisitioning by their own troops, grain seized, wells drained, livestock slaughtered by panicked units racing east to west. Yet here, at a checkpoint manned by the enemy, the process felt strangely civil. A boy no older than 10 stepped up, holding a chipped enamel bowl. An American cook ladled stew into it, pausing only to blow gently on the rising steam so the child wouldn't burn his hands. The boy blinked at him, confused, then murmured a shy thank you in halting English learned from a pre-war textbook. The cook grinned, surprised, and patted his shoulder. The mother noticed that small exchange and felt something unfamiliar tug inside her, an ache almost like hope. But hope was dangerous. Hope made you look beyond survival. She tried to push it away and instead focused on the line's movement, on the faces that transformed with each step toward the water containers and the steaming pots. Shame still clung to many of them, an almost visible weight. Accepting food from enemies required crossing an invisible threshold, one that wounded pride even as it fed the body. Yet hunger had a way of silencing the arguments of ideology. As the line thickened, the sergeant motioned for a second pot to be brought forward. A corporal jogged toward the vehicles to fetch more rations. Supplies were not limitless, and planning for dozens was far easier than planning for hundreds. But the Americans kept working with disciplined steadiness, portioning carefully, refilling water containers, doing what soldiers in all armies were trained to do, maintain order in the face of unpredictability. The mother shifted, feeling blood return to her legs. She wanted to help, though she had little strength left. But more than that, she wanted to understand. Before the war, she had taught children to memorize maps, dates, patriotic songs. She had believed, with uncomplicated certainty, that enemies were born from malice. Now, watching the Americans wipe spills, steady stumbling elders, and crouch to reassure fearful children, she realized that the boundaries of enemy were thinner than she had been taught. Two women behind the canvas whispered as they waited for their turn. One insisted the Americans must be doing this to keep order. The other argued that no army wasted rations on people it despised. Both theories held slivers of truth, but neither explained the tenderness in the medic's gestures as he examined a child's fever, nor the quiet way the young soldier encouraged an elderly man to sit before he collapsed. These were decisions made not for strategy alone, but for dignity. Soon, the field kitchen became the unlikely center of the ruined village. Steam rising into the cold air, ladles scraping the bottom of pots, bowls clinking against metal tables. Children who moments earlier had been frightened to approach now lingered near the warmth, sniffing curiously at the scent of potatoes and barley. Civilians spoke in hushed tones, unsure whether they were witnessing a temporary miracle or the first hint that the nightmare of war might be loosening its grip. The mother felt her stomach twist, not in hunger, but in the slow, heavy return of something she had buried months ago. She wanted to believe. She wanted to accept that this moment meant more than ration distribution. She wanted to trust the gentleness she saw in the soldier's eyes. But trust required safety, and safety was a fragile thing in wartime. She looked down at her son, whose breathing was now steady, his small fingers curling around the edge of her scarf. The simple rise and fall of his chest made her throat tighten. Just as she began to stand, her knees still unsteady, a commotion rippled through the line. A group of civilians, 20, maybe 30, appeared at the far end of the road, emerging not in single file, but in a disorganized mass. Some carried carts, others dragged blankets holding what little they had salvaged. Their faces were gaunt, their movements erratic, driven less by intention than by raw desperation. The sergeant stiffened. The young soldier stepped forward instinctively. The medic glanced at the mother, then back at the approaching crowd, calculating the strain this would place on already thin supplies. The mother's breath caught. She knew that kind of movement, the frantic surge of people who had nothing left to lose. And from within that cluster of ragged figures came a voice, wavering, exhausted, yet unmistakably urgent. "Pleased, water. We heard you have water." The Americans exchanged a single look. Everything was about to change. The new wave of civilians approached with the desperation of people who had been walking for days. Their clothes clung to them like shadows. Their eyes were sunken, darting between the ruins, the soldiers, and the makeshift kitchen as if unsure which direction held salvation and which held danger. The American sergeant took one long breath, then nodded for his men to widen the line. No one said the words out loud, but everyone understood them. We cannot turn them away. In war, refusal sometimes killed faster than bullets. The mother, still seated with her son nestled against her, watched the scene unfold with a calm born from exhaustion. Her own terror had already cracked and softened in the hours since she arrived, replaced by a fragile curiosity about the intentions of these foreign soldiers. Now, as the mass of newcomers stumbled closer, she recognized in their faces the same blend of fear and longing she herself had carried that morning. A woman near the front clutched a baby wrapped in a torn blanket. An elderly man held a dry wooden bowl with both hands, as though it might fill itself through sheer hope. The Americans adjusted swiftly. One soldier repositioned the water barrels. Another signaled for the remaining rations to be transferred forward. The young soldier who had offered his canteen earlier moved toward the crowd with measured steps, raising both arms to slow their approach. "Easy," he murmured, not expecting them to understand, but hoping they would feel the steadiness in his tone. And they did. The frantic movement settled into a trembling hush. For a moment, the entire ruined mill felt like a crossroads suspended in time. Germans who had been taught to fear Americans standing 3 steps away from them. Americans trained to fight Germans ladling soup into their bowls. History books rarely to the sergeant. "She says you saved her child. They were told you would not help them." The meaning landed with quiet force. The sergeant looked at the mother, and for the first time since she arrived, their expressions met without confusion or fear, just a shared recognition of how far the war's lies had stretched, and how easily they had torn in the face of a simple act of help. The young soldier beside him shifted his weight, almost embarrassed by the sudden solemnity, and muttered something about just handing her water. But even he knew the moment mattered. The mother reached for the translator again, this time with confidence rising through her fatigue. She wanted to speak for all the civilians who kept stepping into the line, each one carrying the burden of propaganda that had promised cruelty and delivered the opposite. She whispered again, "WWII begin here, etwas neues." Perhaps something new begins here. The translator repeated the phrase, hesitant but faithful. The words hung in the air like a fragile bridge, one built out of hunger, fear, gratitude, and the undeniable truth that humanity sometimes survived even where logic said it shouldn't. Around them, the line continued moving, bowls filling and emptying, children drinking slowly as instructed, elderly men sitting down before their legs could fail them. The Americans worked without pause. Their faces revealed exhaustion, but also a growing understanding that they were no longer just soldiers. They were the first sign of stability these people had seen in weeks. And as the afternoon light shifted, something subtle but unmistakable changed in the crowd. Civilians who moments earlier avoided looking at the Americans now met their gaze. A few offered awkward and mentioned these moments. They slipped through the cracks between battles and treaties. Yet they often reveal more about human survival than any victory parade. As the distribution resumed, an astonishing quietness settled over the crowd. Hunger had taught them not to waste energy on noise. They accepted what they were given with murmured gratitude or silent tears. A child cried softly when her bowl filled. Her mother pressed a kiss to her hair, as if reminding herself the war had not swallowed everything after all. The mother holding the revived toddler observed every detail with growing clarity. She saw how the sergeant's hands trembled slightly as he lifted a pot. Fatigue, not reluctance. She saw how the cook wiped sweat from his brow, frustrated not by the civilians, but by the dwindling stew. She saw how the medic's face darkened each time he examined another dehydrated child. These men were not performing kindness. They were wrestling with its weight. The mother wondered whether she could say something to show these soldiers that their efforts rippled further than they realized. But her voice still felt trapped behind days of silence. and the language barrier stood like a tall wall. So she simply held her son closer and watched life re-enter him one breath at a time. Then the moment came that changed everything. A translator, a young German POW working under American supervision, stepped into the clearing. The sergeant beckoned him urgently. As he approached, the mother straightened. She wanted someone, anyone, to understand what she had been trying to say since her collapse. The translator knelt beside her, his expression gentle. She whispered, "Sie haben mein kein Geratet. UNS word gesagt. Word at UNS nicht helfen." He blinked once, surprised, then relayed the words slow, instinctive nods. Others murmured, "Danke," even when they doubted the soldiers understood. The divide between enemy and protector blurred. Quietly, almost imperceptibly, yet undeniably. The mother felt her son stir and open his eyes fully for the first time since morning. His gaze drifted toward the soldiers, then back to her, as if trying to understand where fear should fit now. She brushed his hair away from his forehead, tears slipping down her cheek. These tears were not for loss, but for the startling realization that the war had not taken away every possibility of grace. She looked at the American sergeant once more. He was already turning toward the outskirts, scanning the horizon with narrowed eyes. Not out of suspicion, but because he sensed something approaching. The distant sound of footsteps carried through the broken courtyard. The translator tilted his head. The sergeant straightened. Another group was coming. Not ragged, not starving, but purposeful. And they were not civilians. The mother held her breath. The next chapter of this fragile piece was already on its way.